What do you get when you blend the psychedelic soundscapes of the 1960s, the powerful production techniques of the 21st century, and the introspective lyricism of someone navigating the complexities of modern life? In the world of indie music, one album emerged in the early 2010s as a groundbreaking work that captured these elements. But what's the magic behind it? And can we recreate that sonic journey? Hey there, I'm Steven, and welcome to Off Brand, the series where I dive deep into the artistry and craftsmanship of iconic musicians. In each episode, I dissect the essence of an artist's work, breaking down their songwriting, performances, production, and overall vibe. Then I create an off-brand version of that artist's music, writing an original song based on the elements of what I learn. This is episode 3, and today we're focused on Tame Impala's Lonerism. Tame Impala is a name synonymous with the modern psychedelic music movement. Their second album, Lonerism, is a masterpiece that weaves intricate melodies, hypnotic beats, unconventional chord structures, and introspective lyrics into a sonic tapestry that's equally nostalgic and visionary. It's a record that has resonated deeply with music lovers around the world, gaining recognition for its exploration of solitude, love, and the surreal nature of existence. So how do you put all of these pieces together? Let's see if we can figure it out. This episode is going to be focused entirely on Lonerism rather than all of Tame Impala's work, but it's important to get a sense for how that fits in with the broader discography. As of this recording, Tame Impala's released 4 studio albums: Inner Speaker, Lonerism, Currents, and The Slow Rush. Broadly speaking, as Tame Impala's career has gone on, the sound has changed from this looser psych rock feel that we got with Inner Speaker to much more of a pop dance feel with Currents and The Slow Rush. Lonerism, being the second album in that progression, has a lot more of that loose psych rock feel, but it starts to incorporate way more synthesizers and a lot more of an electronic feel than we saw in Inner Speaker. The song structure in this album differs a bit from song to song. You have some cases where you have a lot more of a verse-chorus sort of feel. Then there's some songs that are a lot more unconventional, which you see more on the later half of the album. The chords that are used are similar in some ways to what you would expect to see in a 1960s or 1970s psych rock song. I think they're very emblematic of a theme that shows up in a lot of aspects of this album, which is taking sort of conventional ideas and turning them on their head. It's not that every chord is entirely revolutionary, but it's the way that chords and things that you would expect to hear are combined with these unconventional elements that makes it sound like something we've never heard before. One of the most defining aspects of this album is the lyrics. They almost have this stream of consciousness quality to them that makes them sound extra raw and extra deep. There's sort of this coming of age aspect of the lyrics. It sort of makes sense because this album came out at a point in time when Kevin Parker was in his mid-20s and he wasn't the iconic figure that he was years later, and he was still trying to figure out how to make sense of life as an artist. In the final mix of the album, the lyrics are very quiet, and Kevin did that intentionally. He even says that now he wishes he had made them louder, but at the time, he was just so afraid of being that vulnerable on an album of this scale. I totally get it. I mean, some of these lyrics are very fragile. To put them out on an album that is of any scale really is impressive, even if you keep them quiet in the mix. At this point, this channel doesn't have the resources to go out and get all of the gear that was used on this album. However, I will talk about what was used and show you how you might take a more limited set of gear and create a similar sound. Let's start out with the bass. Now in this case, I actually do have a slightly cheaper version of what was used on the album, which is a Hofner Ignition bass. It's the same style of bass that was used by Paul McCartney in the Beatles, so it has that classic psych rock sound. Before talking at all about how the sound is processed, let's get a couple things straight up front. First of all, you want to be using flat wound strings. Flat wounds are the alternative to round wound strings, and they have a much darker and more mellow sound. The second thing is that for this style, you want to be using a pick instead of your fingers. Okay, now let's talk about the processing of the sound coming out of the bass. The first thing that you want to add is a little bit of saturation or distortion. The second thing is a ton of compression. And in my example, I put several different compressors on to give it the right sound. Each of these pieces adds a different element to the sound. The saturation gives a lot more high-end or treble frequencies, which helps it cut through a mix a lot better. The compression, on the other hand, adds a lot of thickness to the sound so that it doesn't die out as quickly and sounds much fuller in a mix. Here's an example of a bass line with no effects applied. And here's what it sounds like when you add saturation. And then finally, here's what it sounds like when you add the compression. Now let's talk about the bass technique. The bass lines on Lonerism are super melodic, very similar to the style that Paul McCartney played, especially in that middle era of the Beatles. Now, sort of going along with this melodic bass idea is that the lines rarely go very low. There are a lot of points where he doesn't go lower than the lowest note of a guitar, which is a full octave higher than the lowest note of a bass. When there's a lot going on in one of these songs, the bass tends to stay a bit simpler, but when there's more space, the bass opens up a lot, and that's when you'll see those melodic lines show up. Feels Like We Only Go Backwards is a great example where there's some space for the bass to do more things. So at the end of some of those lines, the bass explores some really interesting ideas. All right, now let's get into the guitar. While the Tame Impala bass sound has this like warm, thick, almost soothing sound, I tend to think of the guitar as being the opposite. The guitar sounds differ a bit from song to song on the album, but for the most part, when I hear an electric guitar, it's got this crunchy aggressiveness to it. It really helps the guitar cut through the mix, and it helps differentiate it from all the other elements. Since the guitar sounds vary a bit from song to song on the album, I'm gonna pick a few examples and show you how I would achieve those tones. Kevin Parker is known for using a Rickenbacker guitar. I think he used a few other guitars such as a Stratocaster on this album as well. I have an ES-335 Gibson guitar, and with that I'm hoping I can get a similar tone to what Kevin Parker gets with the Rickenbacker. For creating this sound, I've got the tone knobs all the way up, and I'm gonna be using the bridge pickup, which is gonna make it sound nice and twangy. In order to achieve this sound, I used the Guitar Rig 6, which is actually pretty straightforward. I was able to find a setting on there with an amplifier and a few effects that could model that thick, twangy sound. Now, a similar sound is achieved in a number of different places where you basically take those same effects and you crank up the reverb on it. One of the other iconic guitar sounds on this album is the thick fuzz guitar sound, which is used on a couple of songs like Elephant. The two things that I needed to do to get the right sound: first of all, turning down the tone knobs on my guitar. Second of all, I found I had to take a fuzz sound and crank it a lot further up than I initially wanted to, but when I was A/Bing it to the sounds on the album, that's how I was able to get it much closer to the right tone. I found with this guitar sound that I really had to have the mentality of this will sound good with everything else, because I think some of these tones are just a little bit much alone. It's just when you combine them with everything else that it all starts to meld together much better. Okay, drums. Along with the bass and the vocals, the drums are one of the most defining elements of the Tame Impala sound. To me, they're the biggest part of what separates each Tame Impala album from the other. Kevin has said in interviews that he spends more time working on the drums than any other instrument. Kevin played a vintage-style Ludwig kit for this album. Again, a Beatle instrument. The sound that he achieves with these drums has been sought after by many drum enthusiasts, such as myself, for years, and it really wasn't recorded in a very conventional or even ideal way. He used only a couple of simple microphones to record the kit, and he did so in a room that wasn't treated very well acoustically. I'm paraphrasing this a little bit, but he said in interviews that he put a lot of emphasis on the emotional feel he got behind the drums. There's a lot of power when you sit behind a drum kit and the way that that feels when you're playing, and he wanted to capture that and put it in this record. I think that intentionality really shows because there's something emotional and different about the drums on this album that makes it stand apart from pretty much any other drum sound I can think of. There are a number of different specific things you want to do to get this kit sounding right, but two of the most important ones are to use the right drums, that Ludwig style kit, and to compress all of the drums together so you get a very powerful sound. I'm going to show you the sounds that I've found, and I'll show you before and after I add the compressor to show you just how big of a difference it makes. There is so much that goes into nailing the drum technique, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just gonna focus on a few basic things. One of the beats that shows up a lot throughout this album is the halftime rock groove. It's got a lot of power in the downbeats, but there's a lot of little subtleties that separate each occurrence of it in the album. One thing that we see showing up a lot with that pattern is the addition of ghost notes. For those of you that don't know, ghost notes are basically just additional little notes added in to accentuate the playing. So a similar beat with ghost notes on the snare would sound like this. Now that's for the slower grooves. When things pick up a bit, there's a variety of different things we see. Here's some examples of what that might sound like. The other really important thing to mention on drums is the extended use of drum fills. Drum fills typically give the drums an opportunity to play some additional notes, and they're used in transition points. Now, in some genres, such as psychedelic rock, the drum fills can go on for longer periods of time, and that's exactly what we see on Lonerism. I mean, Mind Mischief is basically a fill for 50% of the song. So instead of just playing a fill like I did there for a brief section of time at the end of a bar, Kevin will fill up larger chunks of space with that. Vintage synthesizers play a key role in a number of the songs on this album. He used the Juno 106 extensively. I have a Juno 106 and I'm gonna play around with some of the sounds I can get on that. He also used a few other synthesizers, which I don't have, but I'm gonna use a number of vintage software synthesizers to try to emulate sort of similar sounds and come up with things that are in that general realm. Vocals. As I've already mentioned, Kevin is very well known for his breaking of conventional rules. One of the most famous rules that Kevin breaks is in his overuse of reverb and in his ordering of the signal chain with reverb and compression. For those of you that aren't familiar, signal chains are basically just a sequential set of different effects that modify an audio signal. However, the specific ordering of those effects matters. So how does that show up in Kevin's vocals? The conventional rule with the use of compressors and reverb is to put compression first and then reverb afterwards. The effect of putting a compressor after reverb would make the reverb way too intense, and conventionally that is not what we want with vocals. However, that is exactly what the Tame Impala vocal sound became known for, and it had a huge impact on indie musicians everywhere. Now, in my attempt to recreate the vocal sound, that was one of the important pieces I wanted to factor in, but there are a few other things that showed up that I want to cover here. At a basic level, I used saturation, compression, delay, reverb, and EQ. According to what I've read, Kevin used a vintage Sennheiser microphone to record the vocals. The frequency response of that microphone is going to be a lot different than the SM7B, this mic here, that I use to record my vocals. So essentially what I had to do was take the signal that I had and modify it afterwards to make it sound more similar to what he achieved. Now, aside from the technical specifications, I had to figure out how to make my voice sound like Kevin's. Once again, with the Beatles comparisons, Kevin's vocals sound a lot like John Lennon. Kevin sings fairly consistently in a higher register. He's sometimes singing in a thinner, high chest voice, and other times he goes into falsetto. When I went to recreate the sound, I also used many layers to recreate the vocals, and that was often a combination of falsetto and chest voice to blend them together. Putting it all together, here's an example of a vocal line from Lonerism with different levels of effects applied. This could be the day that we push through. This could be the day that we push through. This could be the day that we push through. All right, now let's see if we can take all of these elements and write an off-brand Lonerism track. I spent days and nights digging through the anatomy of this album, reading about how it came together and searching for inspiration for an original song. But unlike in some of my previous episodes, it was much more difficult to find a starting point on this one. I was generating a lot of ideas that sounded close to the right vibe, but I was lacking a vision or a focal point that I could build upon. I wanted to write my song in the same way that Kevin writes for Tame Impala, but according to him, that process seems like less of a process and more like waiting for random inspiration.
That's part of the essence of it, is like not really knowing what you're doing.
Hours spent trying to piece together different ideas started to add up, and eventually I started really burning out on the process. I was so close to giving up. But that's when it happened.
Is it real or just imagination, darling?
The core idea, the chords, the rhythms, suddenly things started to click. My new central melody turned into a lyric about loneliness and about dreaming. My smorgasbord of different chord ideas started to coalesce on a chorus, and a bridge started to come to mind, which gave me an opportunity to explore backbeat and more extreme effects like flangers and stronger reverbs. While there was still my fair share of banging my head against the wall, trying to write a meaningful song that sounded like Lonerism and also could stand on its own, I eventually started to piece things together. All right, I've just about wrapped everything up, but before I show you the final output, I want to talk a little bit about the Ableton session and show you a few of the challenges I ran into when I was putting everything together. Let's go check it out. I ended up using a ton of different instruments on this track, and while they weren't all playing at the same time, it still took a while to put them together. I used 10 different synthesizers, 7 guitars, 7 vocal tracks, a bass guitar, drums, and just a ton of effects. Tame Impala does an extremely good job of having a lot going on in a mix and making everything sound so effortless at the same time. I found it challenging to get that rich depth of sound that you get when you have a lot of instruments, but still getting things to sound focused. Generally, I followed a similar process to what Kevin followed on this album, taking big swings and trying things out and then figuring out ways to get it to work together later. But this took a long time and it was definitely not the most straightforward process. I had to do a lot of automation on the effects just to make sure there was a lot of differentiation between sections and to carve out the sound so things work together well while having that nice psychedelic quality. Finally, getting the master just right took a long time. It was a balance of trying to get those vintage sounding effects and also trying to get the EQ dialed into the right point. I ended up getting something that I'm pretty proud of, but it took a lot longer than I expected. Then to top it off, I went to Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, where I took a picture for album artwork that looked pretty similar to the cover of Lonerism. I also bought this wig so I could have the right Tame Impala looking hair. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close. All right, let's see how it turned out. Now time for off-brand Tame Impala Lonerism.
Can we pretend that
Hey folks, thanks for watching this video. If you haven't already, if you can like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. More than anything though, if you could leave a comment letting me know what you like about this style of video, that would be awesome. I'm looking at finding a little bit of a different way to make these videos that's a little quicker to make, since it's been a while since I've made one of these. So thanks for stopping by, and if you want to watch more off-brand, check out one of these videos.